Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of The Daily Dilemma. I am your host, Sophie Daly. Today's episode, I will be discussing two of the most pressing issues of the 21st century, climate change and migration. These complex phenomena have been heavily discussed in the global discourse as two distinct crises, but there is a lack of confidence to acknowledge the causative relationship between them. Their connection is often contended with other factors like population growth, poverty, governance, human security, and conflict, and these are seen as the causal mechanisms of migration. Despite the convolutions of the climate migration nexus, decades of research have shown us that this is a growing concern. Thus, global actors must reconsider their political agenda to challenge the adverse effects of climate change. That is, displacement, migration, and relocation of individuals. In this specific episode, I will examine the urgent reality of the climate migration nexus in the context of the Pacific Island countries and territories. I further discuss the notion of responsibility and how it contributes to the climate migration policy conundrum. Lastly, I explore what the future holds for a global climate migration agenda. Natalie Haas, an Austrian policy officer, researcher, and human rights activist, discussed the fate of climate mobility in her TED Talk, Changing the Discourse on Environmental Migration.
According to World Bank findings, which are so far considered to be the most accurate, climate change could force 216 million people to migrate by 2050.
Given the knowledge gaps within this subject matter, 216 million is only a rough estimate for the number of people likely to be involved in migration related to climate change. However, the impacts of climate change on migration will be more acute in particular regions, like the Pacific Island countries. PICs are facing an existential threat. Many of these islands are low-lying and sit only a few feet above sea level. Their geographical location, compounded with their socioeconomic status, makes them extremely vulnerable to climate change. The Secretariat of the Pacific Regional Environment Program underscores the most substantial impacts, including losses of coastal infrastructure, the land and more intense cyclones and droughts, failure of subsistence crops and coastal fisheries, losses of coral reefs and mangroves, and the spread of certain diseases. These effects have profound implications on community security, specifically land and livelihood security. This is where we see one of the connections between the environment and migration. When nations become less able to provide land, livelihood, and habitat security, it increases the demand for both internal and international migration opportunities. And this is just in regard to voluntary movement of individuals and families. This doesn't even consider the concept of forced migration induced by climate change. The UN High Commissioner for Refugees stated that globally, natural disasters force an average of 21.5 million people from their homes each year. Entire populations are forced to leave their homes and migrate to a different part of the country. Some individuals are even forced to engage in cross-border displacement. These natural disasters, like flooding, hurricanes, cyclones, are exacerbated by climate change. This underlines another area where climate and migration are interconnected. Given the severity of this situation, political inaction and global unwillingness is unacceptable. Left unchecked, internal displacement and international displacement will worsen. Entire communities within the Pacific Island countries will lose their livelihoods, and it even proposes a threat to their cultural identity and sovereignty. Before I discuss the fate of climate migration and its externalities, I first want to analyze the current approaches to the issue and unveil the shortcomings of these policy approaches. Currently, the international community tends to harness a climate refugee perspective, in the sense that their principal focus is the long-term or extreme climate impact necessitating large-scale forced relocation from some Pacific islands. Upon initial review, this seems like a positive development within the decision-making process. It presents some level of initiative from the international community, but in reality, referring to these individuals as refugees is detrimental to the perception of these individuals and further delays policy development. In 2014, the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific published Climate Change and Migration Issues in the Pacific. Within this report, they highlighted the fact that Pacific Islanders disapprove of the discourse surrounding climate refugees, as it portrays them as helpless victims without choices and downplays their role in shaping shorter-term adaptive strategies and voluntary migration responses. Even though the locals have continually expressed their opinions on the matter, the international community often ignore the wants and needs of these individuals and will continue to concentrate on the long-term outcomes. Instead of tackling the root causes and addressing the issue of climate change head-on, the global community sees this as an issue that may or may not come. As I've stated before, the subject of climate-induced migration is extremely understudied and provokes little urgency from the international community. Just because there is no concrete way to predict what will happen if we don't act, the international community shows minimal capacity to address the concerns of these vulnerable individuals and merely skip to the end result. Global actors' inability to administer a holistic approach is embodied by New Zealand's failed experimental humanitarian visa. In 2017, the then new Minister for Climate Change, James Shaw, proposed the world's first experimental humanitarian visa category for Pacific Islanders displaced by climate change. It aimed to bring 100 people to New Zealand each year. Although this so-called climate visa was praised by many around the world, the plan was dropped after only 6 months. Why did New Zealand not follow through with this scheme? Well, the sole reason was because it was rejected by the Pacific Island countries. This approach was fundamentally an outsider's perception on what is best for the Pacific Island communities and ignored the priorities and desires of what the affected people actually wanted. The Asia and the Pacific Policy Society summarizes 3 essential priorities of the Pacific Islands. First, they want to see a drastic cut in greenhouse gas emissions. For decades, these small island states have pressed the international community to limit global temperature to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Pacific peoples argue that no industry should take priority over the safety of human beings, no matter their developmental status. Secondly, for Pacific Island countries, land poses critical importance, not just in the economic context, but from a cultural and psychological perspective. To these communities, there is a profound intimacy between human existence and to a person's ancestral lands. In this regard, people want to stay in their homes to preserve Pacific society and culture. The third priority speaks to the notion of worst-case scenario. If Pacific Islanders are going to move, it is going to follow the concept of migration with dignity, and not to be forced to vacate their homes as refugees. Migration with dignity is a framework aimed to give Pacific Island communities agency over whether, when, and how they migrate. It seeks to maintain cultural integrity and ensures that destination states provide access to education, employment, and healthcare so that they don't lose the skills and knowledge gained from the parent country. Pacific Islanders call for wealthy nations to open up pathways for migration so that individuals have a choice. By listening to and working with the communities who are the most vulnerable to climate change, the international community can adapt their approaches to adhere to the priorities of Pacific Island countries in an effective manner.
But the simple political will that is necessary, not just to come here and make promises, but to deliver on them and to make a definable difference in the lives of the people who we have a responsibility to serve.
That was Mia Mottley, the Prime Minister of Barbados, at the opening of the COP27 Leaders Summit. Right now, the world governments are gathered together to discuss how to effectively tackle the global challenge of climate change. This platform is a chance to put climate migration on the global political agenda. It is an opportunity for countries to go beyond grand speeches and false commitments. It is time for the developing nations to administer real action. What does this action look like? It is the United States and other industrial nations drastically reducing their greenhouse gas emissions. Pacific Island nations, who are only responsible for 0.03% of global greenhouse gas emissions, are forced to bear the burden of climate change, while countries like the US and China combined produce nearly 40% of global greenhouse gas emissions. This is the most crucial step in minimizing forced climate displacement. It is also imperative that developed nations support short-term adaptation efforts. It requires more robust political will and financial assistance that build upon the current frameworks for disaster risk reduction. Because majority of human mobility induced by climate occurs internally rather than across national borders, the nation-states are the primary entity managing and administering policy responses. These nations are already challenged with economic instability. Therefore, without external aid, these disaster reduction strategies prove to be inaccessible. Adaptation efforts may also include sustainable advancements in the built and physical environment. These policies would include proper planning of urban settings, which considers the expected increase of the urban population due to climate-induced migration from rural areas to urban environments. In the most severe cases, where communities have no other option but to endure international migration, developed nations must provide legal migration pathways. That means following the Migration with Dignity policy response strategy. A 2012 research study showed that increasing voluntary labor mobility options would enable Pacific Islanders to meet their own needs in accordance with their values. Policy needs to enhance opportunities for individuals who are forced to migrate so that they can pursue sustainable livelihoods. Although Pacific Islanders do not easily accept planned and orderly migration as an adaptive strategy, proactive planning becomes increasingly important in the current climate. The policy recommendations I just stated are far from simplistic, but something as complex as climate change-related migration demands careful and specific governance response. There is no universal solution, and each country will have different focus areas for policy response. Even though this issue is highly intricate, the international community, developed and developing nations need to work together to put climate migration on the political agenda. And that completes today's episode of The Daily Dilemma. Don't forget to join us tomorrow for another episode. Thank you for listening.